All right, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. As you know, this is your one-stop shop for getting up to speed on some pretty fascinating stuff. We're diving into, well, a massive stack of research, and we pull out the good stuff, the important takeaways, to help you really become an expert in well, basically anything. And today, oh boy, we've got a really intriguing figure. We're going to be exploring his life and work, and we're doing it, with a kind of a philosopher's eye, trying to get at the deeper meaning of his ideas. Like we're explaining it to a fellow philosopher who loves a good, complex argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Today's deep dive is going to take us into the world of Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali. I know it's a mouthful. We just call him Al-Ghazali. He was born way back in the 11th century in Persia and lived until the early 12th century. This guy was a true polymath, a real Renaissance man before the Renaissance. He was a philosopher, of course, a theologian in Sunni Islam, a legal scholar, and even a mystic.
Wow, okay, so he was clearly a busy guy. And to navigate this vast intellectual landscape, we've got an amazing resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry on Al-Ghazali. It's super detailed and really the gold standard for understanding his work. So what we're aiming for today is to really get into Al-Ghazali's ideas about Aristotelian philosophy. It was called Philosopher back then, and see how it influenced Islamic thought, but also how it still resonates with philosophical questions today. So first things first, who was this guy?
Well, Al-Ghazali led a remarkable life, filled with both intellectual achievements and a deep, deep spiritual journey. He was born in Tus, that's modern-day Iran, and he studied with Al-Juwayni, a very important figure in Asharite theology. It was a really influential school of thought in Sunni Islam. They believed that human reason had its limits when trying to understand God, so they really emphasized the importance of revelation. This background in Asharism, it really shaped Al-Ghazali's later work.
Okay, so his early education was pretty important then. It sounds like it really set the stage for his later ideas.
Definitely. And, he didn't stay a student for long. He became a super influential intellectual, a professor at the prestigious Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad. Imagine that. This was during the time of the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah and his vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. He was at the heart of the political and intellectual scene, a true thought leader of his time.
It's hard to imagine the kind of influence he had, but I guess in those days, these intellectual giants were real power players. So was it all smooth sailing from there? Did he just stay in Baghdad and teach and become even more famous?
Well, not quite. In a really dramatic twist, he actually abandoned all his high-profile positions in 1095. It was a major turning point in his life. He went through a deep spiritual transformation. He was really influenced by Sufi mystical literature, focusing on inner experience and direct connection with God.
Wow, so this was more than just a career change. Sounds like a real existential crisis. What happened? Why did he leave everything behind?
Well, it seems that he felt this huge conflict between living a truly virtuous religious life and the compromises that come with serving in power. He even made a vow never to serve political authorities again or teach at institutions funded by the state. He saw a potential for corruption, even in the world of ideas.
It's a fascinating tension, this pull between pursuing knowledge and power versus spiritual purity and detachment. A true philosopher's dilemma.
Right. Though he did eventually go back to teaching at smaller, more independent schools for a while, and he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, seeking deeper spiritual understanding. Then, in a somewhat surprising move, he returned to teaching at the state-sponsored Nizamiya Madrasa in Nishapur in 1106.
Interesting. It's like he came full circle. So after all that soul-searching and rejecting the establishment, he ends up back where he started. Why?
Well, he saw a lot of theological confusion spreading among the people, and he was under pressure from the Seljuk court to come back. He seems to have thought of himself as a muhi, a renewer of religion. This figure, according to Islamic tradition, appears at the beginning of each century to revitalize the faith.
I see. So he felt like it was his duty to return, like he had a special role to play in setting things right.
Exactly. But this comeback, and even his earlier masterpiece, the revival of the religious sciences, they weren't universally loved. There were people who accused him of being too influenced by falsafa. And this leads us to the heart of the matter. Al-Ghazali's complex and fascinating relationship with this philosophical tradition, this tradition rooted in ancient Greece.
All right, so let's dive into that. What exactly was falsafa and why was it so controversial?
Well, it's a fascinating story in itself. Falsafa emerged from this massive translation project. You see, in the 8th century, they started translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic. And so the Philosopher, the Arabic philosophers, they inherited this late antique understanding of Aristotle. but it was heavily filtered through a Neoplatonic lens.
Right, so it's not pure Aristotle. It's got this extra layer of Neoplatonism. How did that change things?
Well, it really shaped how they understood, big stuff like metaphysics, cosmology, even the nature of God.
Hmm.
Key figures in this movement were thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna. They developed these really sophisticated philosophical systems.
Hmm.
And sometimes they even challenged core Islamic beliefs, like, the idea of creation.
Oh, so that's where the controversy starts. It's one thing to study philosophy, but it's another when it starts to contradict the religious doctrines.
Exactly. Al-Farabi, for example, he followed Aristotle in arguing for the world's pre-eternity, meaning the universe always existed. This directly challenged the Islamic belief in creation ex nihilo, God creating the universe out of nothing.
So it was a pretty radical idea at the time, and it sounds like it really shook things up in the Islamic world.
It did, and Al-Farabi went even further, claiming that prophets and philosophers ultimately reached the same truths. But prophets used simpler language, metaphors, stories, so the masses can understand. Avicenna built on this and created this huge, influential system of metaphysics. He even tried to offer rational explanations for Islamic beliefs.
Wow. Okay, so Al-Ghazali is living in this intellectual melting pot, all this ancient Greek thought clashing with Islamic theology. So how did he engage with Philosopher? Did he just jump right in and start debating with everyone?
Well, he was definitely not one to shy away from a good intellectual challenge. He actually studied Philosopher in great depth.
Right.
He claimed to have spent 2 whole years just immersed in these texts before writing his big critique, his famous Incoherence of the Philosophers.
2 years. That's some serious dedication. It's like he wanted to become an expert in Philosopher before taking it down.
Exactly. And his engagement went beyond just studying. He wrote significant works explaining the teachings of the philosopher. There's a fragment we have on metaphysics. And his really important work, The Doctrines of the Philosophers. That was basically his take on Avicenna's philosophy for Al-Ghazali.
Okay, but wasn't Doctrines thought to be just a warm-up for his incoherence? Like a summary of the arguments he was about to refute?
It was, for a long time. But nowadays, scholars see it differently. They think it was probably a separate project. It's just that the introduction and conclusion were framed later to link it to the incoherence. And this is important because it led to a huge misunderstanding in the West. They thought Al-Ghazali was an Avicennan, a supporter of his ideas, instead of the critic he really was.
Oh, so it was like a historical accident that totally misrepresented his position. Like he was writing a guide to the enemy's strategies, and people thought he was giving away his own battle plans.
Yeah, kind of. And what's really fascinating is how popular Doctrines of the Philosophers became in medieval Europe. It was translated into Latin and Hebrew, and it became way more influential there than in the Islamic world. The funny thing is, they called him Al-Ghazal in the West and thought of him as this big Avicenna fanboy, especially because the Latin and Hebrew translations often left out his criticisms.
Wow, so it's like a double whammy. First, he's mistaken for an Avicennan because of how the book was framed, and then even his criticisms get removed in translation. It's a real case of lost in translation, isn't it?
It is. Think about figures like Dominicus Gunnisalivi, who brought this text to the Latin world. And then giants like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, they relied on it as their main source for Arabic philosophy. It's amazing to think how this one text shaped Western thought in the Middle Ages, and it was all based on this misinterpretation of Al-Ghazali's intentions.
A true philosophical plot twist. Okay, so we've seen how his attempt to explain Philosopher was received. But what about his own criticisms? His famous incoherence of the philosophers, and his dealings with the Ismailites. Let's dig into that part of his work.
Right. So his incoherence of the philosophers is often called a refutation, a rad of Philosopher. But it's more complicated than a simple rejection. His main problem was with the philosophers' claim that they had a better, more certain path to knowledge than divine revelation. They believed that their logical proofs, their burhan, were superior.
So it wasn't a epistemological debate. He wasn't saying they were necessarily wrong about everything, but that their claims of absolute certainty were unfounded.
Exactly. He was basically challenging their arrogance. He argued that their reasoning often relied on unproven premises. They were just blindly accepting ideas from their predecessors. This is what he called taqlid. He even suggested that some of their insights might have actually come from revelation given to earlier prophets, but they wrongly attributed them to their own reasoning.
So he was putting them in their place, so to speak, reminding them that human reason has its limits.
Exactly. Now, the incoherence covers a lot of philosophical ground. 16 of the 20 discussions are about metaphysics, the nature of God and reality. and 4 of them deal with natural sciences. His discussion on causality is especially well known, and the very first discussion tackles the controversial idea of the world's pre-eternity. He was drawing on earlier arguments against this Aristotelian concept.
Okay, so he was engaging with some pretty fundamental questions. Did he disagree with everything the philosopher said?
Well, he thought most of their positions were just wrong, but not necessarily dangerous to religious belief. He called them innovations, or bida. But there were 3 teachings, mostly attributed to Avicenna, that he found really problematic, both philosophically and religiously. He thought they could lead people to unbelief, to kafir.
Okay, so these must be the real deal breakers, the ideas that cross the line. What were they?
The first was the world's pre-eternity, the idea that the universe has always existed. Then there's the claim that God only knows universals, not particular events, so he wouldn't know what you and I are doing right now. And finally, the denial of the soul's physical resurrection, the idea that the soul doesn't return to the body after death.
So on these points, Al-Ghazali felt that Philosopher was directly contradicting Islamic revelation.
Yes, he was very concerned about these ideas undermining religious law and belief. He even issued a fatwa declaring those who publicly supported these 3 positions to be outside of Islam.
Wow, so he really drew a line in the sand. It's not just an intellectual debate anymore. It's about defending the faith.
Exactly. And he wasn't just concerned with the philosopher. He also took aim at the Ismaili Shiites in his work Scandals of the Esoterics. He saw them as a threat to the Sunni establishment, both religiously and politically. They were using these esoteric interpretations of the Quran that he found very dangerous.
So he's fighting on 2 fronts, against the philosophers and against another branch of Islam.
You could say that, but it's important to know that his understanding of the Ismailites wasn't entirely accurate. He attributed to them beliefs like the existence of 2 gods and a complete denial of bodily resurrection. These aren't actually part of their teachings, but it shows how worried he was about any deviation from Orthodox Sunni Islam.
Okay, so now we've got to ask, where did he think falsafa belonged in Islam, if at all? His book, The Decisive Criterion for Distinguishing Islam from Clandestine Unbelief, might give us some answers.
Right, in that book, he defines what constitutes unbelief, and it's a very specific definition. He says it's the denial of 3 core doctrines: monotheism, the prophethood of Muhammad, and the Quranic descriptions of the afterlife, resurrection, judgment, all that.
Okay, so those are non-negotiables. What about everything else? Was there any room for philosophical discussion?
Interestingly, he was actually quite tolerant of other teachings, even if he considered them wrong. He even endorsed the acceptance of good philosophical ideas as long as they didn't contradict those core principles.
So, a bit of a balancing act. Reason is fine as long as it doesn't clash with revelation, but it sounds like there's still a lot of room for interpretation.
There is, and this is where his approach gets really interesting. He argued for judging each philosophical idea on its own merits. If it was logically sound and didn't contradict revelation, then it was okay. This opened the door for later Muslim thinkers to incorporate certain philosophical concepts into their theology and ethics.
I see. So he wasn't completely against philosophy. He just wanted to set some boundaries.
Exactly. But there was also a political side to his critiques. He was worried about the philosopher and the Ismailites causing social and political instability. He feared that people might start disregarding Sharia, the religious law. And in the case of the Ismailites, he saw them as a threat to the Sunni Caliphate.
Right, so he was also thinking about the practical consequences of these ideas. It wasn't just an abstract philosophical debate.
Now remember how the Ismailites criticized Sunni theologians for their use of reason? Well, in response, Al-Ghazali actually used the concept of burhan, demonstrative proof, to defend Sunni theology. He argued that reason was valid and important when it agreed with revelation, and he thought that many disagreements among Sunni theologians were just because they weren't being rigorous enough in their reasoning.
Okay, so he's using the philosopher's own tools against them, in a way.
Precisely. And this led him to formulate his famous rule for dealing with conflicts between reason and revelation. He said, if a philosophical claim can be proven with solid logic, with burhan, and it seems to contradict the literal meaning of Scripture, then you need to interpret the Scripture metaphorically, using tawil to uncover a deeper meaning that's consistent with reason.
That's a pretty sophisticated approach. So it's not about blindly rejecting reason, but it's also not about blindly following the literal meaning of Scripture. You need to use both.
Exactly. For example, the Quran describes God as having a hand or sitting on a throne. Well, ta'wil would mean interpreting these anthropomorphic terms metaphorically. Maybe they represent God's power or sovereignty, in light of reason's understanding of God as immaterial.
I see. So it's about harmonizing reason and revelation, finding a way for them to coexist.
Right. And this rule became super influential among Muslim theologians. But it also had its critics. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, believed that Scripture should always have priority over reason. And Averroes, while agreeing with the general principle of harmony, disagreed with Al-Ghazali's conclusions about what could and couldn't be proven. His book Incoherence of the Book of the Incoherence was a direct response to Al-Ghazali. He argued, for example, that you actually could prove the world's pre-eternity philosophically.
It's interesting how this debate continues to resonate today. Even centuries later, people are still grappling with the relationship between reason and faith, and Al-Ghazali was a key figure in shaping that conversation. All right, let's shift gears now and look at his contributions to ethics, especially his monumental work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences.
Ah, The Revival. That's considered by many to be his masterpiece. It's an incredibly detailed guide to ethical conduct for Muslims. It's all about how to live a good and virtuous life in accordance with Islamic teachings. It has 4 main sections: rituals, social interactions, virtues, and vices.
So it's like a comprehensive manual for ethical living. Did he break any new ground in his ethical framework?
Well, he definitely had some strong opinions. He was very critical of people who were too focused on worldly success and material possessions. He emphasized the importance of preparing for the afterlife. And you see a real shift in his understanding of salvation. It's not just about having the right beliefs anymore, it's about your actions, about how you actually live your life. This really reflects his growing interest in Sufism and his focus on the practical side of faith.
So it's not just about intellectual assent, it's about embodying your beliefs in your daily life.
Right. And his ethics are really centered on developing virtuous character traits. He criticized what he saw as a shallow understanding of ethics in traditional Sunni Islam, where it's all about following rules and imitating the Prophet's outward actions. He wanted something deeper, a real transformation of the soul.
So a change of heart, not just a change of behavior.
Exactly. And this is where his idea of Riyada al-Nafs comes in. Disciplining the soul. This is about actively cultivating inner virtue.
How does that work in practice? What does it mean to discipline your soul?
Well, it's about using your reason to manage your emotions and desires, to strive for a balanced and harmonious character. It actually echoes Aristotle's idea of entelechy, something realizing its full potential. So you're using reason to help your soul reach its virtuous potential. For example, managing anger and desire through conscious effort and reflection.
It sounds like a demanding process, but also a very fulfilling one, this idea that you can shape your own character through deliberate effort.
And Al-Ghazali saw a connection between the ethical ideas of the Philosopher and the Sufi mystics. He even thought that the philosophers might have borrowed from the Sufis in some cases. This fits with his general idea that many philosophical truths were already known through revelation or mystical insight.
So he saw a convergence between these different paths to knowledge and virtue, but he was still very much rooted in his Asharite background.
Oh, absolutely. He was a firm believer in the Asharite view that human reason alone can't tell us what's truly good or bad. He thought that only divine revelation, as expressed in the Quran and the Sunnah, could do that.
So ultimately, morality comes from God, but he also introduced some interesting ideas into Islamic jurisprudence, didn't he?
He did. He emphasized the principle of public benefit, or maslaha, in legal rulings. This means that you can consider the overall well-being of the community even if there's no specific rule in Scripture.
So it's a bit like a utilitarian approach in a way, trying to maximize the good for the greatest number of people.
You could say that. He especially focused on the 5 necessities: the protection of religion, life, intellect, offspring, and property. He thought legal interpretations should always promote these fundamental goods.
So he was trying to create a legal system that was both grounded in revelation and responsive to the needs of society.
Exactly. All right, let's talk about his cosmology now, his view of the universe and how it all works.
Okay, let's do it. What did he believe about the origins and the structure of the cosmos?
Well, he lays out a pretty strongly deterministic view in the Revival. He believed that God is the only creator and the only real agent in the universe. Everything that happens, including human actions, is preordained by God. He used the analogy of a water clock, where every movement and outcome is predetermined by the clockmaker's design.
Okay, so no free will in this picture. Everything is part of God's plan.
Right. God didn't just create the universe and leave it alone. He's constantly sustaining it. And even our choices are part of this grand, divinely orchestrated plan. He even agreed with Avicenna that this is the best of all possible worlds, reflecting God's perfection and wisdom.
I see. So it's a very ordered and purposeful universe. But what about causality? Didn't he have some pretty radical ideas about that?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
It's actually one of his most debated and influential contributions. In the 17th discussion of the incoherence, he challenges the idea of a necessary connection between cause and effect. He doesn't deny cause and effect completely, but he argues that we only observe a regular sequence of events, not a real, unbreakable link.
Okay, so he's questioning the very foundation of our understanding of how the world works. Why? What's the problem with a necessary connection?
Well, he thinks it implies that created things have their own power, that they can act independently of God.
Hmm.
And this goes against his core belief in God's absolute sovereignty. He explores different positions on causality. The first one he looks at rejects the idea that approximate cause, the one we observe, is the sole cause of an effect. This is a critique of materialists and some Utazilites who believe that created things have their own inherent causal powers.
Okay, so he's setting the stage for his own view. What's next?
Then he gets into what he calls the second position. This is where he engages with Avicenna's idea of necessitarianism, and he presents two approaches to counter it. The first one is occasionalism. This is a pretty radical view. It says that God directly creates every single event at every moment.
Wow, so God is like a cosmic puppeteer controlling every little detail.
Right. And what we see as cause and effect is just God's habitual way of acting. Miracles are just God suspending these habits.
Okay, so it's still a deterministic universe, but with God directly pulling the strings. What about the second approach?
Well, that one's a bit more moderate. It allows for the existence of natures in created things, and it says that these natures can act as secondary causes. But it also emphasizes that we don't know everything. So what we see as miracles might actually have natural causes that we just don't understand yet.
So a bit of mystery left in the universe, but still within God's overall plan.
Exactly. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether Al-Ghazali considered both occasionalism and secondary causality as valid options. In the 20th discussion of the incoherence, he seems to suggest that both could be true, that God could act directly or through secondary causes.
So he leaves the question open, in a way.
He does, and even in his later writings, he never really takes a definitive stance on this, but one thing he's clear about is that God's habits, what we might call the laws of nature, are unchanging. He often quotes verses from the Quran that emphasize the consistency and order in God's creation.
So even if God is acting directly at every moment, it would still look like a universe governed by laws.
Right, and that means that even miracles are part of God's preordained plan. They're not random or arbitrary.
So to sum it up, Al-Ghazali was this incredibly influential thinker who wrestled with some really fundamental questions about philosophy, theology, and ethics. He engaged with the legacy of Greek Philosopher, trying to figure out where it fit within Islam. And he wasn't afraid to challenge some of the biggest names in philosophy, like Avicenna.
And his impact was huge. He shaped the intellectual landscape of Islam for centuries. His ideas about reason and revelation, about the limits of human knowledge, they're still relevant today.
And his influence wasn't limited to the Islamic world. His work was translated into Latin and Hebrew, and it had a big impact on medieval Jewish and Christian thought as well. It's amazing to think how one person's ideas can travel across time and cultures like that.
And this is where I want to leave you with a question, our dear listener, especially if you're a philosopher. Think about Al-Ghazali's critiques of absolute certainty, his exploration of divine will and causality. How do those ideas resonate with philosophical debates today? In epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, what can we still learn from him? And where might we disagree with him?
Yeah, those are really great questions to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the life and thought of Al-Ghazali. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore his ideas further.